Hi, this is Scott Bradfield, and this is the even more unprepared than usual, unshaven, pimply. I got a big pimple on my nose. All dog version is Misty, all Misty version of reading great books in the bathtub. So this is there's no bath this time. There's just complete um, a failure to show any sort of prepared or authoritarian version of literature. I have no idea what I'm doing. I just read some good books this week, and I thought we'd talk a little about one of them. Um, I'm in a funny position where I embarked on one of these kind of large, giant books that we've been talking about, like Ulysses or J.R. John Barth's Giles, Goat Boy, as part of our 1001 Nights of John Barth series, is probably the book that's least known by Barth. And whenever I meet people who are Barth fans, they kind of dismiss this book. And I read it when I was about 17 or 18 and loved it. I just really, really loved it. Thought it was very funny once I understood the world it was in, and have always wanted to reread it. So rather than read our books in sequence in Barth, which I was playing with the idea that we would try to do a series of lectures in sequence over the next few years of all of Barth's books, I thought basically we would try to read all of the books before Letters. Letters is this big epistolary novel that Barth writes that features all the characters from all his previous books. And Giles Goat Boy, Jacob Horner, is one of the characters in it. So I'm reading around kind of potluck in a way, and I started this about a week and a half ago and really enjoyed it. I'm about 300 pages into it. I really strongly recommend for those of you who are playing along at home to go get a copy of Giles Goat Boy and start reading it. I think you'll enjoy it. And then about a third of the way through it, I got an assignment for working on a writer who I really am enjoying. So I've had to put this aside for a couple of weeks. So I thought before I forget all the things that are happening in it, because I have a terrible memory, I would just give you a quick intro to Giles Goat Boy, and we'll try to finish up in a few weeks when I can get back to him. Okay, so Giles Goat Boy, I don't know if it's Giles or Giles. That's how bad it is today. This is a terrible lecture. Don't ever take a class from this person. Um, the the conceit of this book is similar to the conceits of all his books. The major one is that as soon as we start reading it, as readers, we're reminded we're readers of a book. We're placed in the same way that the floating opera is about a man recalling an event in his life when he was writing a book about his life, about his father's death. The series of stories within stories becomes even more complicated in Barth's later work, in the same way that stories within stories is part of the complexity of 1001 Nights. Okay, so we start this one with a publisher's disclaimer, which is a perfect thing for Barth. And these are the sorts of things I've got to warn you, as a reader, and particularly as a young reader. And then there's a joke of a cover letter from the author, and then and then we start the book. Now, this is the sort of thing that when you saw in a book, when I see a preface to a book, I always skip it, especially if it's a fictional book. And you'll see a lot of writers, particularly in the 60s and 70s, who start making you read these prefaces. The most obvious one the most famous one to my mind is Lolita. You start off with a letter from some terrible psychoanalyst who's explaining what we're going to learn by reading Lolita, about how we're going to learn about the complexities of child molestation and stuff, and we're going to be educated by this story of Humbert. The whole gimmick of most of the writers who do this is to make a fool out of you unless you kind of catch on quick. The joke is that when you go into fiction believing you're in a real world, you're an idiot. And that you should recognize quickly that it's a series of artifices and stories and fabulous ideas and narrative ideas, such as the 1001 Nights, which are there to entertain you and to delight you and to transport you somewhere else. Now, you may or may not agree with that notion of fiction, but it's a premise of it's a in-your-face premise of many of these writers. So we start with the publisher's disclaimer, and we have a series of different of editors at this publishing house explaining why they've taken the book and why we shouldn't buy the book and why the author is a horrible man and why the author is a good man and why we're publishing John Barth when John Barth is kind of not making a lot of money for that publishing house. And it's quite a funny opening, and you have to read it even though you don't want to read it. Then we have a letter by John Barth talking about the recovered manuscript conceit that you'll see in novels going back to the beginning of the novel, where you've got somebody, John Barth says, I didn't write the book. I was working on the book when this character shows up in my office and delivers this manuscript. So it's the delivered manuscript of a supposedly true story that you'll start to see in people, all the way back to Richardson, and even I think Robinson Crusoe is presented as a narrative that somebody's written and been delivered to the publisher. So this sort of gimmick is placed before you at a point where you may not want to read these passages, and they are a little annoying the first time through, though they're pretty funny if you give them a little bit of time. And you don't really get to the novel until page 50, I think, page 40, and it's the first reel and the second reel. And each section of the book is called a reel, and they're talking about computer reels from from 60s computers, because the notion of the computer as generating stories and inventing stories is an idea that Barth latches on as soon as the computers become significant presences in the universities where he lives and works. Okay, so if you can get to page 40, you then get into a sort of a narrative which I'm going to summarize quite quickly for Giles Goat Boy, and probably as usual imperfectly. And that is that it's set in a kind of mythologically continuous alternate reality where the entire world is a giant university. It's almost taking the idea that these writers in their ivory towers are just writing about their ivory towers and they don't know the real world. They live in their universities, which a lot of writers are doing in the 60s and 70s to make a living. And it takes that whole landscape. So we're in a big, giant university, campus, and it's New Tammany College, I believe, is the name of it. But there's two universities as you start to go through it. And basically, there is a Western university and there's an Eastern university. So it's the Cold War between these two massive universities. The narrator of our story is Giles, the Goat Boy. And Giles is a boy who's raised with goats at the beginning of the story and who feels a little different. And he's raised by a man named Max, who turns out to be kind of an old socialist Marxist university professor from the 50s, which will tell you a little bit more about Max in a minute. And Giles has been living out there as a goat boy, thinking he's a goat. And he has a girlfriend goat, and he has friends to hang out with goats, and people come by to look at him. And eventually a woman comes out to visit him who sort of seduces him with lots of presents and peanut butter sandwiches and seduces him to get him to like her. And he misunderstands her and tries to have sex with her. And it's quite clear to us within about the first 100 pages that the woman he tried to have sex with is possibly his mother. Okay, so this is the level of humor that we're getting in this book. It's very, very, very intricately well written. It is about as Giles learns, he's embarking across the campus to go to commencement day, which is when, of course, all these students go to commencement and are graduated from this university. Well, what happens then after that, I'm not entirely sure. And in the course of it, he starts to learn the history of New Tammany College. It's basically a sort of 60s version. You think about the 60s and the universities, such as Johns Hopkins, where Barth is writing, and you have two forces, really, which is sort of military ROTC forces, who are basically trying to develop military intelligence and military weapons and soldiers to go fight the other side. And the other side is, I forget who they're called, the Nicolayan University. I can't remember offhand. The other university is trying to do the same to us. Now, we have a giant computer called WESCAC, WESCAC, and I forget what that stands for, but it's an acronym for this giant computer, which in the 60s was originally just supposedly, keeping data and dealing with emissions. And now it's become an intelligence, which has taken over the university. And certain academics have decided to give the computer the ability to think for itself. So this is the 60s, remember, and again, this is all stuff where it's very topical for 2018, and it has a control over its own campus and the minds of the people on it. In fact, what it can do is it can actually eat people's brains if it wants to. It can take all their information and just leave them as husks. Now, this is kind of a period during the 60s when you have the riots, the campus riots, and campus riots in Giles Goat Boy are kind of symbolic of World War I and World War II. So it's not, you can't read it as an exact allegory, and if you could, it wouldn't be any fun. But there is a notion that there were these huge cumulative political events, the campus riots 1 and 2. And at the end of them, they were kind of controlled by the fact that WestCAC could control its own population. On the other side, there's EastCAC, so the Russian-type campus has created their own weapon system. So there is a notion of a Cold War going on where there's kind of mutually assured destruction between these two different giant computers. Okay, so this sort of background is sort of filled in as we move through, and we're getting images of and ideas of different philosophies of university life. One of which is the socially responsible one of Max, who helps develop this computer and is so disgusted by what it does and the violence it commits against people that he runs away and lives with the goats, and is taking care of this goat boy who mysteriously appeared in the book stacks as a baby. And there's lots of theories about who he belongs and where he's from. Again, think of all these these are typical narrative ploys in all sorts of mythology and good legends and storytelling and fairy tales. The boy no one can identify, the mysterious parents somewhere, the journey across the campus. I'm not going to say too much more than that for now, because you really have to you've got to get to page 50. And I don't really need to tell you the plot, because once you get into it, it's really well written. It's very detailed. It's a series of comic scenes, which you should enjoy. If you don't read it. And then in the course of it, we meet a lot of people who have different philosophies of academia. And at one point, again, it was supposed just to educate people. And then it becomes a research lab for sort of bourgeois liberal versions of academia, which is bring competition into the university, bring competition in terms of attracting grants to the university. And there's a character in here named Ira Hector, who's kind of the bad guy. He drives around on a motorcycle. He's kind of like the cool guy from the 60s. He hear a bunch of people run around on motorcycles. And I want to describe just really briefly who Ira Hector is and how Max describes him as this character. And you'll hear a vision of how universities should operate. Ira Hector, Max reminded me, was the wealthy and infamously selfish older brother of the former chancellor of NTC, New Tammany College. From humble beginnings as a used book peddler, he had risen to his present position as head of a vast informational empire, controlling the manufacture and distribution of virtually every reference volume published in the West Campus colleges, ready to line his pockets at anyone's expense. He was despised and catered to by liberals and conservatives alike, though always closer in spirit to the latter. While he preached the virtues of free research, what he practiced was the stifling of competition, the freedom of the clever to oppress the ignorant and stupid. Yet so enormous was his wealth, and so ubiquitous his influence, every new Tammany chancellor had to come to terms with him. So you're seeing this sort of bad guy is the guy who's trying to kind of collect and quantify and make profitable the materials being generated by the university in textbooks and in approved knowledge and in weapon systems and in certifiable research for corporations that pay for it. So Barth is writing very, very funny stuff about what happens to our universities in the 60s. So you could read it. You should really just read it for the pleasure of the book. There's so many funny scenes and strange scenes and disturbing scenes and mythological characters. There's a gigantic guy named Croker, and there's who carries Giles all through the book. There's the motorcycle pack of kind of neoliberal of academics running around with their beards and their kind of fake leftist leanings. And then you have the real old leftists like Max who are hiding out. And you have this really escalatingly fascinating, rich, mythological landscape as we travel across it and try to find our way to commencement day. I don't remember what happened, so I can't tell you the surprise endings yet, but I'll read through it, and when I'm finished, I'll maybe give a little catch-up session on what I think is one of Barth's best and most overlooked books, Giles Goat Boy. I think it's a really great read, and if you can get through that first 50 pages, or at least try to enjoy those first 40 pages, because they are pretty funny, then you should get into a really, really unusual book, and I think you'll have it's worth trying. And you don't need the help that you would probably need if you're reading Ulysses or Gaddis. Once you're into it and you take the time to get into the story, it should just kind of sweep you along, like most of Barth's books. Okay, so we'll see you in a week or two when I finish this and gotten some other work done. And say goodbye to Misty. Misty, you want to say goodbye? Misty, do you want to say goodbye? Oh, she's asleep. All right. And I'll try to get myself in more presentable shape for the next episode of Reading Great Books in the Bathtub. Bye.